call for reconciliation. Pope Francis weighs in on the protests in the United States, and he has a strong message for those involved in riots and violence. Terror organization. Analysis of the White House efforts to target the group Antifa. In the hot seat, the former Deputy Attorney General faces questions over his role in the Russia probe of the Trump campaign. And we remember the anniversary of Pope John Paul II's trip to his native Poland in 1979. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020.
Very reunited with my family, trying to get justice for my father. And no man or woman should be without their fathers.
You want justice?
And we want justice for what's going on right now. And I appreciate everyone for showing him some support and love. I thank y'all for that.
The son of George Floyd speaking today on the spot where his father was killed while in police custody. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Late this afternoon, the Minnesota Attorney General increased the charges against the officer who killed George Floyd to second-degree murder. The 3 officers on the scene are now charged with aiding and abetting a murder. 8 days after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, his son and the lawyer for the family visit the makeshift memorial where Floyd was killed.
We thank the Minnesota governor for bringing human rights charges against the Minneapolis Police Department, because we absolutely believe that he was tortured in the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life.
The son and attorney for the Floyd family paused to remember George Floyd this afternoon. After fires and vandalism, a calmer scene in the nation's capital. The Defense Department drafted contingency plans for deploying active-duty military troops if needed, but that would be extremely rare for our nation. The Pentagon chief addressed that issue today. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, here at the White House, President Trump tweeted in all caps, "law and order." And the press secretary this afternoon made it clear what the First Amendment does not allow.
More protests in the nation's capital, but an improvement from earlier chaotic scenes. Today, the White House press secretary briefed reporters.
The First Amendment does not give anyone the right to riot. The First Amendment does not give anyone the right to loot. The First Amendment doesn't give anyone the right to burn down buildings.
National Guard troops and federal law enforcement officers called in to quell the storm. This morning, easy to spot all over town. But as for using active duty forces for law enforcement in the U.S.,
I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Defense Secretary Mark Esper says, no way, not now.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now.
Meanwhile, more reaction from the president's recent visit to St. John's Church near the White House, burned in the riots. President Trump faced criticism for his walk to the church, but Johnny Moore says it was not a photo op. The religious freedom advocate says he was standing for the protection of the right of peaceful protest, standing against the violent anarchists who are dishonoring and exploiting the memory of George Floyd.
The politicization of that by people of faith is very unfortunate.
And just yesterday, counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, weighed in.
I think it's very unfortunate that people of faith would call into question what is in anyone's heart, including the president's.
And as for the ever-lurking coronavirus,
I worry terribly about the peaceful protests. I see some wearing masks. I see some others not wearing masks.
Separately tonight, the Republican National Convention was supposed to be held in North Carolina later this summer in August. Looks like that's not going to happen. President Trump is looking for a new venue. He wanted the place packed and people not wearing masks, but he's not getting those guarantees. Tracy?
White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. Thanks so much, Owen. Pope Francis weighs in on the protest in the United States.
per il riposo dell'anima di George Floyd.
At his weekly talk at the Vatican, the Holy Father said defending life at all stages includes fighting racism and exclusion, but he also denounced violence and looting, saying they are self-destructive and self-defeating. Faith leaders here in the U.S. are echoing those calls for an end to the violence marring protests around the nation. Reverend Eugene F. Rivers III, director of the William J. Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies, writing in part, any coherent conception of justice must be indivisibly connected to the rule of law. Reverend Eugene F. Rivers III joins me now on Skype. Reverend Rivers, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the privilege.
I know that you've spoken and written in the past, including a piece in Time magazine 2 years ago about racism and violence. In your opinion, what is the model for us to get us out of this difficult moment?
I think that they say John Kennedy said it. I think that this crisis is an opportunity. I think this crisis is an opportunity for the people of faith because I believe that in an odd way, we have to recover basically the teachings of Jesus, the prophets, and Martin Luther King. That's the way out. It comes back to biblical faith, Christian faith, and the idea that God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a God of justice and peace. So, you know, it's difficult now, but we've been in worse situations than this. And I think the challenge before the church is to make a decision that we're going to deal with the tough news. We're going to tell it with truth and love and promote reconciliation. The church has the answer. We've just simply got to make the decision that we're going to live according to the teachings of the gospel and follow the way of Jesus for, you know, love, peace, and reconciliation.
Well, Reverend, well said. Let's talk about the progress that you've seen there in Boston in terms of the partnerships between the police and the community.
Absolutely. Boston, as you could imagine, 30, 40 years ago, was a tough town in the question of race. You may not have been born yet, but in the mid-'70s, Boston was more racially violent than Alabama in 1973, 74, 75. And one of the things that the Southerners used to laugh about is they said, I don't know why y'all talk about the South. Look at Boston. They're stoning people, and it was terrible. Now, long short, the faith communities came together, and today, Boston is the model for faith community law enforcement partnerships due to the leadership of the Catholic Church in the city of Boston, working in partnership with the Black churches. It's an amazing story.
Well, Reverend, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. Reverend Eugene F. Rivers III, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bless you.
Former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein testified today before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, senators really have their hands full this week. Not only are they drafting new legislation to address police misconduct, but also more funding for federal aid for the COVID-19 crisis and working to set the record straight, like today's hearing about the investigation of Russia's interference in the 2016 election.
It was the Russians who stole the emails. It was the Russians who have divided the American people in terms of the 2016 campaign. But it wasn't the Russians, my friend, who withheld information from the FISA court.
Chairman Lindsey Graham defending this hearing amidst the COVID pandemic, historic Black Lives Matter protests, and Democratic outcries.
They can't deal with the two major crises of the day, racial justice and the COVID crisis, and they're busy pursuing conspiracy theories.
Chairman Graham says Democrats would think differently if this was about an investigation into a Democrat in the White House.
It was the Department of Justice, it was the FBI, it was people who hated Trump if people had a political bias, an agenda to destroy him before he was elected and after he was elected. And we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein defended his decision to name former FBI Director Robert Mueller as special counsel over the investigation into Russian election interference. But he seemed to regret authorizing the renewal of an FBI application to monitor former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page.
Every application that I approved appeared to be justified based on the facts it alleged.
If you knew then what you know now, would you have signed the warrant application?
No, I would not.
The Judiciary Committee votes tomorrow on whether to subpoena testimony from top Obama officials.
That hearing was taking place on the inside. On the outside, take a look at this. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the walls of the Capitol. So far, it has been a very peaceful protest as people are demanding justice and police accountability. Meanwhile, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are currently working on legislation to bring change. I'll continue to keep you updated. Tracy?
Okay, Eric, thank you so much. Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill. In London today, thousands of people protested the death of George Floyd. Aerial views show most of the protesters practiced social distancing. It was organized by Black Lives Matter in Hyde Park. This is the second protest in London this week. On Sunday, hundreds marched on the U.S. Embassy. In France, a government spokesman says protests in Paris are not comparable to protests in the United States.
Je crois que la situation de nos deux pays ne sont pas tout à fait comparables, ni sur le plan de l'histoire.
The spokeswoman also says the protest was banned because of the coronavirus pandemic restrictions in France. Police in Paris fired tear gas at a rally yesterday. Demonstrators were protesting at the death of George Floyd and against police brutality and the death of a French black man who died in 2016. The leader of Hong Kong is trying to justify China's new national security law, saying the Parliament of Hong Kong is deadlocked between reformers and pro-Beijing lawmakers.
As a chief executive, and I have to confess that with the current legislative council and the political climate in Hong Kong, there's no way that in the foreseeable future that we could do it.
Carrie Lam met with Chinese officials today in Beijing to discuss the new security law. Hong Kong's mini-constitution allows the former British colony to enact security laws, but Lam says the stalemate in the Hong Kong legislature made it impossible to agree on local laws to safeguard security. Cyclone Nisarga is hitting the west coast of India near the financial center of Mumbai, and it's 18 million people today. High winds whipped skyscrapers in the city and shanty houses near the beach. A storm surge threatens low-lying slums, but shanty towns just south of Mumbai, where the storm came ashore, are getting the brunt of it. Italy opens its borders to European and international visitors in the final phase of lifting the lockdown. Rome's airports are open for business today. Families and loved ones stranded since the lockdown started in March are anxious to reunite. And Italy is welcoming tourists from foreign and other European countries. The move is aimed at boosting Italy's collapsed tourism industry. The two main Russian Orthodox cathedrals in Moscow are now open and holding services. Both Christ the Savior Cathedral and the Epiphany Cathedral started welcoming parishioners yesterday, but they have to wear face masks. All the Orthodox churches in the Russian capital were closed on April 13th. The others will reopen this Saturday. Coming up, a closer look at Antifa, a group the White House wants to classify as a terror organization. President Donald Trump has blamed Antifa activists for the violence of protests across the country, saying that he wants to designate Antifa as a terror organization. But what exactly is this group Antifa, and why is it receiving so much attention? Joining me now on Skype to answer this question is Charles Colley Stimpson, Senior Legal Fellow and Manager of the National Security Law Program at the Heritage Foundation. Colley, thanks so much for coming on.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
So I know so many folks are maybe hearing about this group for the first time. Can you explain a little bit more about what Antifa is, what they stand for, and maybe what their history is here in the United States?
Yeah, Antifa has been around a while. It stands for anti-fascists, but they are fascists, ironically, and they're a loosely affiliated group that's highly organized, however, well-funded, and rather angry at the United States and the rule of law. And so they've carried out a series of attacks around the country. One of the more notable ones was in Portland, Oregon, many years ago, when a journalist named Andy Ngo was bashed in the head and really injured badly. And so, to the extent that they or groups affiliated with them were involved in this, the president is right to direct the Attorney General to go after them.
Antifa has been named as being largely responsible for the violence that we have been following the death of George Floyd. What exactly do we know about its involvement, and is it something that can be easily spotted?
Yeah, I don't know in the public domain whether we have enough information to know exactly what their involvement is, and that's why there will be investigations, hopefully at the state but also federal level. But to the extent that they are, if they are, then the federal government, if Antifa people associated with Antifa have triggered federal law, in other words, crossed state lines or used interstate communications to carry out their acts, and that would trigger federal law. If not, then a lot of the stuff we're seeing on TV are common law crimes, and states are amply, adequately housed with criminal laws like burglary and robbery and looting and destruction of property to prosecute and hold people accountable, whoever these people are.
As mentioned, President Trump has said that he plans to label Antifa as a domestic terror organization, and Attorney General William Barr even said, quote, "The violence instigated and carried out by Antifa and other similar groups in connection with the rioting is domestic terrorism and will be treated accordingly." How will that work, and how does labeling Antifa as a domestic terror organization, how does that help law enforcement, and is that something that can actually be done?
It's a great question, because as a practical matter, directing and focusing the attention of the Department of Justice and law enforcement on any group, whether it's the Earth Liberation Front or a white supremacist group or here Antifa, obviously has the full force of the government focusing on that. So he's pivoting off of other issues and making this a priority. As a legal matter, however, Congress has defined domestic terrorism in federal code, but they have not attached a criminal penalty to it. So if they're charged with anything, the one thing, whether it's robbery or burglary or something like that, murder, they're not going to be charged with domestic terrorism per se on the indictment, because there is no such crime. It's just a label that describes activity.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming on and giving us your analysis of this that really answers a lot of questions. Charles Kelley Stimpson, Senior Legal Fellow and Manager of the National Security Law Program at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Up next, a recap of yesterday's primary voting in several states. Plus, why St. John Paul II's trip to Poland more than 40 years ago continues to inspire the faithful. The coronavirus delayed presidential primary voting in many parts of the country. Some states went back to the polls yesterday. Joe Biden is on the brink of formally securing the Democratic presidential nomination after winning hundreds more delegates yesterday. Correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Tracy, voting took place in 9 states, including in the District of Columbia, where we've seen protesters raise their voices and march for George Floyd. Yesterday, voters waited in line for hours at polling places to have their voices heard in another way.
A lot of people turned out, maybe a lot more people than they anticipated.
After pandemic delays, many Americans exercised their rights, donning face masks, heading to the polls in places like Rhode Island, Montana, New Mexico, and Pennsylvania. Former Vice President Joe Biden edging closer to securing the official delegate count needed to clinch the Democratic nomination.
I've said from the outset of this election that we're in the battle for the soul of this nation.
Outside one polling place in Washington, D.C., some people waited for over 4 hours to cast their vote, miles from where protesting has been heating up over the last few days.
mobilize and organize and support people who have our best interests at hand. This administration has shown time and time again they do not have the interests of the American people at hand.
For pro-lifers, a number of big primary wins in elections that go beyond deciding who takes the White House. The pro-life group Susan B. Anthony list says key congressional seats are up for grabs in November.
We were very pleased with last night's election outcome. All 8 of our endorsed candidates advanced from their primaries, and it was an especially good night for pro-life women like Yvette Harrell in New Mexico and Ashley Henson in Iowa.
Republican Congressman Steve King, known nationally for controversial remarks that seemed to defend white nationalism, lost his bid to be nominated for a 10th term.
And in Ferguson, Missouri, which captivated the nation's attention in 2014 after the fatal police shooting of African-American man Michael Brown, the city has voted in Ella Jones as mayor. She is the first black mayor in Ferguson. Tracy.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Correspondent Mark Irons reporting for us tonight. Thank you again. This week marks the anniversary of Pope John Paul II's historic trip to his native Poland in 1979. During Mass for Pentecost, the newly elected Pope called for the Holy Spirit to liberate the country. Poland at the time was under communist rule. 300,000 people cheered for nearly 15 minutes straight. Joining us now from Warsaw, Poland, is Father Paweł Rytel Andrianek, spokesman for the Polish Bishops' Conference. Father, welcome to the show. It is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be with you.
All right, Father, can we talk about St. John Paul II's trip to Poland? What impact did that have on the country and also in ending communism?
It was one of the most important trips in 2,000 years of papacy. St. John Paul II in Warsaw prayed this prayer: let your spirit descend, let your spirit descend and renew the face of the earth, this earth. And we think that from this trip and from this prayer changed the history of not only our country, but also of other communist countries, because it was the beginning of the solidarity movement. It was the beginning, actually, of the end of communism. And he gave hope to the people. And the people, in exactly 10 years, changed the history of Central and Eastern Europe. So this is why it was one of the most important trips in the papacy ever.
And that trip happened back in 1979, but does it still have meaning for the people of Poland today?
Absolutely, because when we think about St. John Paul II, we think that he changed our lives. He changed our history, but not only here in Poland, but also in Russia, that he wanted to go to Russia, but he couldn't go to Russia. He also changed the life in other parts of the world. We have to say that he was a hero of freedom. He was a very close friend, we could say so, with President Reagan and Bush, and he did fight for freedom of the people. So when we think about St. John Paul II, we think about Pope who was for the sanctity of life from the beginning to the end. We also think about the Pope who brought freedom to the people, and this trip was very important.
He died back in 2005. That said, do you think that his legacy continues to have an impact on the people of Poland?
Absolutely. His legacy continues. You can see on Twitter the hashtag, Thank You John Paul II. In 15 years after his death, as you said, many people wrote on their Twitter accounts, words of thanks to John Paul II. It shows that his legacy continues, and especially the legacy for the sanctity of life. Maybe we can say this, that St. John Paul II had, very, very profound history in his family. Actually, his parents, we could say, we were like saints. He grew up in the Holy Family. But what I would like to underline, his mother, Emilia, being pregnant with Carol, refused to have an abortion, which was recommended by her doctor. And you know that St. John Paul II fight for the sanctity of human life. And his legacy, and also his legacy and the legacy of EWTN continues also in this level. which means dignity of human life. So legacy of St. John Paul II continues, and is also in the United States, in Poland, in every country. And so we thank St. John Paul II for what he did, and not only for what he did, but for what he does even now, because we pray to him, because he is a saint.
Absolutely, Father. Thank you so much for your time and speaking with us today. Father Paweł Rytel-Andrianek, spokesman for the Polish Bishops' Conference. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.